Light Talk. Lumen Brothers. Light Talk. Light Talk. Light Talk. Lumen Brothers. Light Talk.
Hello and welcome to Light Talk. This is Stan, and I'm broadcasting today from my state-of-the-art studio in the swamps of Gainesville, Florida.
Hi, this is Steve in Dallas, Texas.
And this is David, broadcasting from the beautiful Belmont Shore area in Long Beach, California. And we are the Lumen Brothers. Episode 55.
55.
Double nickels. Call me Joey Nichols. Double nickels.
Pennsylvania speed limit, still 55.
Oh, my God. I couldn't live there. Not in my Tesla, if I ever get it. By the way, they've moved the deliveries back another, month.
Did you get your pig?
I got the pig. I got the pig option. They actually have an option for livestock. So I got the pig, and it's got a sunroof, which is nice.
Is it a high-resolution pig?
Yeah, it's a high-resolution pig. It's all state-of-the-art. It's
right.
It's a Tesla. What can I tell you guys? So anyway, welcome everyone. We have a very great show, a very interesting show today. You notice I said great and I changed it to interesting. It's
We don't know yet. We haven't done it. It might be great or it might just be mediocre.
We don't do mediocre shows.
Oh, we do. Yeah, just look at the first 4 episodes.
We do fulfilling shows. But anyway, yes, this is our 3rd episode of Season 2. So welcome, everyone. And why don't we just get started? Steve has the first listener question.
We have a question from Jennifer in Wyoming, and she wants to know, what is the estimated cost of graduate school?
A lot of pain. A lot of pain.
You'll lose your soul.
A lot. A little. Depends on how you look at it.
So, Jennifer, let's talk about the cost of going to grad school. So, I think average tuition, you should plan on $20,000 to $80,000 a year.
Woo!
I think on top of that, you need to consider room and board, and that's probably going to be $15,000 to $18,000 a year.
Ouch!
And then when you look at supplies, probably $1,000 to $2,000, and then I would factor in a miscellaneous cost of about $6,000. So all of a sudden, that sounds like some really large numbers coming at you, but there's some relief here. I think most graduate programs are going to waive tuition, so we can chop that $20,000 to $80,000 right off. They're going to also offer you probably a working or a teaching assistantship to help defer the cost of going to school there. In essence, you're becoming a low-paid teacher or a low-paid worker bee in the shop. So most schools on the low end are probably going to offer about $8,000, and probably on the high end about $15,000, and they'll probably divide that into monthly checks over the school year. So all of a sudden, the room and board cost kind of goes away. You still have those supplies. You still have that miscellaneous. So I think when you really come down to it, I believe out-of-pocket cost for grad school probably on the low end is about $10,000. On the high end, about $14,000. Now, one of the ways you can see if you can actually make that work for you is you can go to the CNN website. And at the CNN website, you can do a search for the cost of living guide. And so you can plug in, I make this much money in Chattanooga, Tennessee. What happens if I move to LA with the same amount of money? And they'll tell you where you're going to come up short or where you might actually improve. Maybe groceries are cheaper in LA.
They're not.
So I think, a big issue here is when we start tossing numbers around. I think in the Midwest, it's not so bad. But if you move into a major market like New York or Chicago or Dallas or LA, costs are going to go up. But I believe you can talk to the school, and they can give you a pretty straight answer about what it costs to live there. David, what do you think?
Well, I think that was great, Steve, because that checking out the cost of living is so important. I think what Steve was talking about is usually like the top 20 or so schools as far as wealth is concerned. People who can afford to give students free tuition, who can afford to give students nice stipends, all that. And a lot of those schools are really great schools. But there are also schools out there. And I'm going to be real frank. Matter of fact, I was kicked out of USITT conference for saying this in front of people, but it's true. Some graduate schools are basically using you as cheap labor. Because you may be saying, well, how could a school offer me $20,000 in free tuition? Well, if you're working in the shop and you're working 20 hours a week, and then you take 2 graduate students, that means they're working 40 hours a week. If a graduate school is offering you $20,000, that means they are basically paying both of those students a total of $40,000 for 40 hours a week. If they were to hire a staff member, that cost would go up quite a bit. Plus, they have to pay unemployment, they have to pay benefits. So a staff member could cost a graduate, a university anywhere between $60,000 and up. So some schools out there, and I'm not going to name the ones, actually do this. And I kind of think it's immoral when they do that. Now, let's be frank, this business, it's really hard to pay back steep school loans, tuition loans, on the type of salary that you can expect to get or fees, once you get out. So it's wonderful that many of these schools, and I'll just tell you right now that Stan and Steve's school, they're honorable schools and they help students pay, not rack up all this debt. I think that's really, really important. So a lot of schools do that, and that's a great thing. The key is you got to look at the value and see, is it worth it? All I can tell you, it's hard for me to justify that unless you are independently wealthy, to go to graduate school and come out $200,000 in debt and be a professional stage designer and to expect to pay it off within a reasonable amount of time. But one other thing, it's interesting about costs. A lot also has to do with what your family situation's like. So I've had graduate students in the past, and I know that Steve and Stan have as well, who have had families. And, you've got to support your family too. And, or your spouse has to work. There must be some sort of income coming in because it's very difficult. Don't expect to work while you're going to graduate school either. Graduate school is a huge commitment. You're going to be spending all your time either working on productions or doing homework. And holding a job, some people do it, but it's very, very difficult.
Well, I think that Steve covered the financials pretty well, and I think our question, I'm just kind of go back to our question, is the estimated cost of graduate school. So Steve's got the financials covered there for you pretty well. There are other costs involved too, and I think David mentioned the word that I'd like to focus on in answering this question, which is value. So what is the value of the graduate school experience to you, and what do you have to give up or trade for that value? So you can trade money, certainly, or you can trade your time. And I think most of the schools, as Steve mentioned, except for, will in some way subsidize or defray your cost. It's sort of like in our profession, you're sort of like an athlete. You have a certain talent, hopefully. Schools are going to be interested in you. They're going to make offers or compete for you to come to their school and sweeten the deal to get you, depending upon who they think they can get, and so on and so forth. So fortunately, in our field, you don't necessarily have to spend a whole hell of a lot of money to get this degree or to get this exposure. What you are trading also, I think, is your time. So do you want to give up 3 years of your life to do that? What will be the return on those 3 years? Should you continue in your career because it's already on a good trajectory? Or do you feel like there's something you're missing or something you really need from the graduate school experience? Will it build a network? Will it help you move to a location? If you live in a rural place where there's not much theater for you to do, then maybe the grad school provides an opportunity to get you into a major market, like Steve likes to say. So I think there's a lot of sort of reasons and costs involved, both on the interpersonal level, or are you giving up family? Are you giving up the place to live? I mean, what other costs are involved? But I think you can sort of manage it fairly well if you're smart and come out without much debt. I didn't have any debt when I finished graduate school, and I moved 6,000 miles to go where I went to get a completely different exposure, a different perspective. So, but I think right now, unless something changes, you should be able to get through a good graduate program at a reasonable outlay, and not come out with too much debt. So the cost, I would say, if you compare it to medical school or law school or some other, white collar profession, it's a whole hell of a lot less. On the other hand, you probably may not have the same earning potential as someone in medicine or law, but you might be one of the lucky few who hits the jackpot. Who knows? So I think it's a pretty good value for what you expend, generally speaking.
Well, let's take a minute to talk about some of the reasons to go to grad school. And I think when you're thinking about this, I believe there's 6 reasons. The first would be personal growth. The second would be greater employment opportunities. The third is career advancement. The fourth is financial reward. The fifth, I think is pretty important, a sense of confidence and a sense of accomplishment at the end of those 3 years. And number 6, credibility and recognition in the industry. So I think grad school is an important thing. I think if you go to grad school thinking I'm going to treat it like a trade school, that's a bad way to go.
Yeah. I think, Steve, that's brilliant. Those 6 points are absolutely dead on. Couldn't have said it better. Beautiful.
Yeah, but guys, grad school's not for everyone.
That's true.
Just look at Brad Schiller. I mean, he'd spent a semester at Cal Arts and realized that grad school wasn't right for him. He's certainly an extremely respected professional and probably making more money than the 3 of us combined. So, it's just not for everyone.
I agree.
One final thing I want to say, because what Steve said, those 6 points are wonderful. And yes, I mean, I went to grad school and I agree with all that. Also, if it depends on if you're going to be working professionally as a stage designer or if you're going to be going into education. And what I'm talking about is the words on your degree, graduated from SMU or MFA from Yale. That does mean a lot when you're going to, when you're going to it for a teaching job. It may not mean that much when you're in the profession. I must say, it's unless you're part of a mafia of people coming out of that school that you've made connections with, like the Yale Mafia, and a lot of our other schools have that as well. Then yeah, that will help you. But for most other designers, you're going to get jobs from the directors. The director likes working with you. You got the job. Doesn't matter what degree you have, or even if you have a degree.
I used to sort of have a lot of respect and sort of maybe even a romantic or sort of natural sort of a wow factor for people who had a pedigree from a certain place, whether it be a school or a business or whatever and you'd be like, oh, wow. And as I've gotten older, I have lost a lot. That luster for me has really worn off. I am less interested in someone's pedigree as I am in who they are and their character and their personality and how they behave and their work. Then I really have found that pedigree actually more often than not for me has been a smokescreen.
So the Walton School of Business doesn't mean much
Not
to you
that
anymore, right?
Gold. I mean, Lehman Brothers used to mean something. I mean, yeah. So I think that the notion that a pedigree alone, not to say a pedigree from a great place or a place with a strong reputation, doesn't have a value sometimes. But I think sometimes we place too much value on that, and then we don't see it'll hide warts and pimples, right? That we're not willing to see because they went to XYZ, therefore they must be, as if there's some kind of exclusionary vetting process. And maybe there was at one time, but I think it just has less of luster for me than it used to.
I agree with that. Joshua in Utah asks, tracking or queue only? Which do you prefer?
Depends.
It depends.
Let me just say, Joshua, tracking. Tracking is what I prefer.
Okay, why, Steve?
I'm less likely to screw something up. Also, it's much easier to move through a show if I'm tracking through the show.
True.
If I go back and do some unique editing, then I'll move to queue only mode. But tracking, all the major consoles default in tracking mode. I just think it's a cleaner, better way to work if I'm going to make a generic rule.
Yeah, there's a use for both. Obviously, I must agree with Steve. I track all the time. Sometimes I record queue only.
Right.
But it's always set on tracking. But before you start recording your show, go ahead and create your block queues. And block queues could be wherever there's a transition in the show, when there's a blackout in the show. Even if they're dummy queues, it doesn't matter. You should record it to block. You set your block queues, hard zeros in those queues, so that if for some reason you are working out of order, then you're not going to be tracking stuff into queues that you've already written.
Right.
Okay. And even if it screws up, let's say your transitions are your proverbial sort of blue backlight, right? The most famous, scene shift light in the world, right? If it doesn't work, if something's tracking through, and when you get to that queue and it's blue light except for like 2 Lekos that are on randomly, well, you can find those channels, you can take them out, and then you update the track, and it cleans up your show. So that's the only reason why you would not want tracking, but tracking just makes sense, and it makes our lives so much easier.
If you're a theatrical designer, if you read a play, I'm going to make a big general statement here. Most plays are constructed by playwrights in a tracking mindset.
Sure.
They're not constructed as a queue-only mindset.
Why don't you illuminate that?
Yeah,
a little bit, Steve?
Explain that one. I like that.
No, I think, are you going to do something like, I don't know, let's say Streetcar? Are you going to take Streetcar Named Desire and make every queue a queue-only queue? You're probably moving something across the landscape of that show.
Yeah, it builds upon itself. Yeah.
And do you really want to take all of your moving lights in a rock and roll world and make them queue-only queues?
Right.
Thus LTP. But yeah, the way the way it was explained to me when back in certain days, when memory, as I understand it, and you guys please chime in here. Let's put a little history spin on this. That when memory consoles came into being, the premium thing was memory. So a lot of memory. So if you are recording all values in every queue, you were eating up a lot of memory. And memory was at a premium. But let's back up to prior to memory consoles.
Piano boards.
All right, things were on piano boards or single scene consoles, or not even multi-scene presets. So, and I think it might have been Ken Billington who said this to me at one point in the past. So if I turn on the table lamp in Q1, well, and the end of the scene is Q20, I don't want the table lamp going off, and does I tell it to go off? So therefore, it tracks. If I turn it on, it stays on until I say it goes off. And that's how those consoles or those controllers work. So that was the natural state. And I agree with Steve's point. Playwrights, generally, they're working with time and the time of the play is moving forward, and things build on themselves. Unless you go to sleep, then maybe you wake up the next morning and there's a new scene. But it is that sort of mentality. So I think that was how sort of the New York theater and the touring theater worked, was in a manual tracking mode. And then when you got into memory, at first, like I said, memory was expensive, and then as memory became cheaper, you could let somebody record all the values in each queue. But the same, if you remember, and I don't know if Josh remembers, but we used to write queues on paper. If a channel on a single scene preset, if a channel didn't change, you didn't write down the value in the next set of boxes or the next set of boxes for the next queue. The assumption was, standard practice was, it tracked. And when you saw a change in value in that channel, then only the changes were what you executed when you were presetting for the next queue, even in manual control. So it sort of comes from a place of history. We sort of grew up with it that way, and like I think David said, if you're making a unique change to a particular queue when you're editing, then sometimes you say, okay, I don't want this moving forward. I only want it in this. And I think even now, maybe you guys can chime in. I think you can track when you're recording. You can say track
Yes, ranges and track back.
Ranges and backtrack, and that's amazingly sophisticated when you think about it. Right,
it's fantastic.
Yeah,
and it does help. I mean, when that happened, that happened several years ago. It really did add much more flexibility. But let's take it back even one step further. It really comes from piano board world.
Yeah.
Because they would have 2 or 3 electricians running these giant piano boards, and a lot of times you'd only change one dimmer or in a cue, or you change 2 or 3 dimmers. To have it all there listed of what everything should be was very, very cumbersome. The problem with that,
you didn't need it. You just track changes.
Except when you were checking the show. I don't know if you guys ever recorded or ever lit a show using a piano board, but the real problem with that, when you're not, when you're using a piano board and you're not writing down every single level all the time, which is what the assistant would do, not the operator, but the assistant would do, is that when you want to make a change on a cue and you have to figure out where all the levels are because they changed 20 times in the past 20 cues. So they don't have the light board operators. They do not have that information. It would take them like 10 minutes to restore all that. But your assistant does. And your assistant at that point, because this is what I used to do as an assistant, you'd talk to the light board operators. You say, okay, dimmer 1 was at 8, dimmer 2 was out, dimmer 3 is at 6, dimmer 4, and they would set it up quickly.
Right, because they were only running the tracks. They weren't keeping track.
Exactly.
Yeah, David, you must have done that in the Stone Age.
No, it was actually the Stone Age. If you consider the 70s.
Oh, wait, okay, the Bronze Age. Maybe
it was the Stone Age. Absolutely.
The Brass Age.
That's the great thing about being old in a technologically sophisticated art form, is that you've seen it all. I didn't see candles, I didn't see gas, but I certainly saw piano boards.
I saw Thyratron tubes, tube banks. Do you remember tube banks?
No, but I've seen them.
my high school had it was a Strand Century 5-scene preset, 64 dimmers, and underneath the stage was a big concrete room called the tube bank, which I had a key to. That made me feel really all powerful, like Oz. And you'd go down there and you see the loads went through these massive tubes on a big steel rack downstairs. Those were the dimmers. There was a tube bank. It's crazy. I loved it.
David, I want to point one more thing out about piano boards. If you go back and you take a look at David Hayes' book, Light on the Subject.
Yeah, great book.
The intro to that is about, I believe it's the National Theater going to Moscow to do a show.
I know that story. Great story.
They're doing tech, and they want to go back and take a look at how things worked.
Right.
And things kept falling apart. And finally, the Russian stagehand said, you've got to give us a time to not write stuff down. You've got to give us a time to memorize the show.
Right.
And
they don't write it.
Once they knew that, they could go to any cue because they knew exactly what they were doing, the sequence they were doing it in.
Yeah, they memorize it by eye. They don't do it by paper.
The only problem with that is when one of them is sick one night and they have to bring in a replacement.
No. They operate like submariners. Every guy knows the other guy's job.
Okay. Stan, next question is yours.
All righty then. Dylan in Ohio writes, what is the best laptop for running Various lighting software and editing programs? The best laptop.
The K Pro 2.
K Pro 2. I think one that doesn't crash, one that you don't spill Pepsi on. I mean, I started out as a Windows guy. Then I got frustrated when Windows was really being bashed by Mac. Remember those commercials? And then I went to Mac, and then I fell in love with Mac. And I still have a boot camp. I'm sitting in front of a 5K iMac, totally tripped out, and it's boot camped into Windows 10, and I work on both sides of it. I think it depends. It depends on what you're doing. I think you can have a great computer from either the PC side or the Mac side. So let me just throw this out there. If you're doing a lot of visualization, I think that Windows actually, because of their sort of they've moved recently towards gaming, to making their computers really good, strong gaming computers. So I think the Windows are doing a better job in terms of the 3D visualization work and in real time because of DirectX and how DirectX acts as a traffic cop for what needs to get to the graphics card faster and slower. Again, I'm not necessarily an IT expert, but that's been my experience. On the other hand, if you want beautiful sort of, if you're working in Adobe and Photoshop and you want beautiful pixels and really great resolution in a 2D world, I think the Macs are fantastic. From a stability standpoint, in the last 5-8 years, I've had better experience with Macs, but I think Windows has now sort of turned the corner and they're building a much more stable platform. I've got both. I use both. But I think, again, we could just real quickly, the best graphics money can afford, a really good screen, capabilities for additional monitors. If you're going to get into CAD work, you need screen space. A good solid state hard drive is good. And, I'll let you guys take it from there.
Well, what Stan has just told you is to build your own laptop. So I would go and take a look at take a look at everything you're trying to run. Take a look at the minimum requirements for that. I probably wouldn't go with the minimum requirements, but 2 or 3 of my hardcore students, and we have a big gaming program here at SMU. Most of these people work from a PC foundation and then really build their own laptops. And that laptop, I'm always amazed at how well they run.
The faster, the better. That's all I have to say.
Well, you are listening to Light Talk with the Lumen Brothers. And this week, Light Talk is sponsored by...
Has your career as a lighting designer taken a nosedive into roadside aquariums, swim meets, and the local water park? Are you finding that each day seems, just a bit more complicated with all that electricity around you? You can't keep wearing rubber boots and gloves. People will start to talk. What to do? Well, kittens, say adios to Mr. Edison and hola to Mr. James Watt. Way back in 1781, Scottish engineer James Watt patented his steam engine, and shortly thereafter, the 10-watt Steam Leko. But by the early 20th century, the Steam Leko had fallen out of favor with the Nikola Tesla fanboys.
That's me.
However, given the EU's recent position on tungsten lamps, the Steam Leko is seeing a rebirth as the go-to green light source. That's right, American Players Theater. Say goodbye to being zapped when it rains. Not only that, the Steam Leko will work with both fresh and salt water, snow or ice, and in a pinch, will even work with milk. You're welcome, Wisconsin. Select models can also be used as a hazer. The Steam Leko, suitable for festivals, rodeos, state fairs, and always a hit with the Trigun crowd. The Steam Leko, available now from Bad Hombre Stage Productions.
Now, back to Light Talk.
Okay, thanks, Dad. So for our For Your Consideration segment, I'm kind of a social media junkie. Which is why this whole Facebook thing is freaking me out. I don't know what to do anymore. I love it. I love, lurking on different group pages. And I know that Stan does a lot of this too. I think Steve has better use of his time. No,
yeah, I have changed my Facebook settings, and I'm only getting stuff from friends now. It's much better. I'm not on it as much.
So anyway, one of my favorite groups is the Lighting Designers group.
I like that one.
There are a lot of people on it, and you get some very interesting discussions. And this is a subject that we actually talked about on the show several months ago. But it came up again, and it was a post from Drew Belinsky. It was an interesting post, and I'm going to read it to you. And I actually asked Drew if it was all right for us to read it on the show, and he said, yeah, absolutely. Now, this actually came from one of Drew's students. That's not from Drew, but he posted it. So anyway, here it is. Let's say I create a cue that I absolutely love and think it's beautiful, but in rehearsals, the director doesn't like it and wants me to change it. The director ultimately wants something completely different from what I had in mind, but I still really want to use the original idea. In the end, who gets the final say? It seems to me, personally, that it's a no-brainer. The director gets the final say. And good directors use designers as collaborative artists. They take advantage of the amazing amount of synergy that is there from working with, other artists. And that's really what theater's all about. So to me, it was really, really simple, no-brainer. But I read a lot of the answers and comments, and I was frankly surprised. I mean, there were some really radical comments like, I'd walk off the show. Right? Or, we'll fight it out,
That'll improve your reputation.
And I'm not going to name names, of this, obviously. But, there was this huge controversy about this. So I'm going to leave it open to discussion with Stan and Steve, see what they think. What do you guys think?
I think someone has to be in charge, and ultimately that person is the producer who makes all decisions. Right. But quite often a producer will turn the artistic decisions over to the director. So right or wrong, you are working with the director, or you can say you're working for the director, and that is the only vision that should count on the show. At some point, someone has to say, I want a blue psych and not a red psych, or I want to cut a couple lines out of the show, and that's the director. In a perfect world, you're working with someone that you can collaborate with, and the two of you are on the same page. But sometimes you're not. So someone's got to make a decision, and that's the director, the artistic leader of the production.
I agree with Steve and David, and I think here at our school we sort of use the metaphor of the production is a ship. And there's a crew, and there are first mates, and somebody has to steer the ship. And if everybody's trying to steer the ship too much their own way, you're going to break the ship apart, and that doesn't get you to the destination. Just torture the metaphor a little bit, and I think that director could crash the ship, and sometimes they do. But I think they're given the reins, and that's there is a chain of command, and we work within it. It doesn't mean that people don't listen to each other, but imagine if you went to war and said, "I'm ignoring the general." I think you sort of have to trust them, and ultimately it's their responsibility. And as David says, to use the talent of their team to best advantage. And I think at a certain point you could. I've had situations where I thought the choice was not the choice that I would make, but. That's not that I wasn't hired to make that decision. The director was, and ultimately, as Steve says, the producer. But artistic decisions do rest with the director, unless the producer's intervening. So, yeah, I'm in agreement with my colleagues on this.
Yeah, I just want to add one more thing. Some of the comments also were like, "I would take my name off the program."
Oh, that's
let's talk a little bit about the politics, and let's talk a little bit about being a theater artist. And one thing I had to make a comment, and I said, something? I said, being on an artistic team in the theater, you all go up together and you all go down together.
Right, sink or swim together.
I mean? And it's a team, and it's not about laying blame. It's not about laying blame. It's about helping each other. And being proud of your work. And sure, I've worked with directors who said, David, I just don't like that cue. Okay, let's figure it out. What don't you like about it? And then, and then we come to something that makes sense for both of us. And I've never reached a point in my entire career, and I've done a hell of a lot of shows, where I said, oh, I just threw up a cue and that the director wanted, I didn't like it. We always came to a point where there was a meeting of the artistic minds. So yeah, you want to be a part of the team. You never walk off a show. The only time you ever walk off a show is if that you're being physically or emotionally abused. That's when you walk off a show. But for artistic differences, I would say absolutely not, because this is a small world and word gets around.
Very fast.
And your career could be over.
I think I've said this before, but I'll say it maybe the same way again. When you get to a point where finger pointing begins, that is the end. That's the beginning of the end of a fruitful relationship. And I do this more often now in construction projects where the budgets and the stakes are pretty high. And I think I told this story before, but I'll just tell it short. One time an engineer said to me, here's what we're going to remember. When something got omitted or something was wrong or something didn't meet the client's, vision or whatever, how you react to that situation is what people are going to remember. And if you immediately go to finger pointing or digging in your heels, that's an expression of character, and that will last. So you always try and got to put yourself in the right mindset when you're having that sort of creative tension. And as David says, remember, this is a team. We're all in this together. We're all trying to get to something we can all feel good about. When you escalate it to that sort of level of friction where I'm walking off or I'm taking my name off the program, to me, that's childish.
Absolutely.
So we have a last question here from Luke Garrity, and he wants to know, what is the difference between an assistant lighting designer, a lighting associate, and a lighting director? Why don't we break this up? Let me take lighting director here. Luke, my personal belief, I don't see a lot of difference between the lighting designer and the lighting director. Mm-hmm. I think that's an interchangeable term. I think they do the same job. The only time it has been apparent to me that it's slightly different is when I was more active in television. I would be brought in every now and then to serve as the lighting director. And generally that would be on a rock concert. There was clearly a lighting designer, and it was his or her vision on the show, no doubt about that. They would bring me in to assist in getting that show up to level so that cameras could see it. But that's changed a lot in the last 20 years. So now you'd be hard-pressed not to be able to do a great lighting show for a rock concert and it not meet television level. The cameras have simply gotten better. So I don't see a lot of difference between the designer and the director. What do you guys think?
Well, that makes sense. I mean, I've been lighting directors. I've been billed as lighting designer. I think I'm called the lighting director for Central City Opera, but I'm basically a lighting designer. It just depends. And you're absolutely right, Steve. It was different about 10, 20 years ago.
What do you think then? I mean, I don't know if Luke worded it correctly, or not correctly, but in a way that I would think about it. He says lighting associate.
Yeah, maybe he means associate. Does he mean associate lighting designer? Maybe that's what he means.
The associate's different. The associate is the person, and again, I'm not reading this out of a book. I'm just telling you how I use associates. Though the associate is the person who's able to actually recreate lighting from the designer, and right. Or that you trust this person so much that you could say, hey, go ahead and you focus the wash, or you focus the show, or whatever. And also that associate, the way I use an associate, they do give me feedback, artistic feedback. There's this one former undergrad student of mine named Nick Solium. He works out of New York. He went to NYU for his graduate work, and he's an associate on Broadway. I used him when I did my show in New York a couple of years ago, and he was fantastic. And and I trust him with everything.
Isn't that the key, David? That the associate could sort of make artistic decisions in your absence, and you would trust them to do so.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you, Stan. You said what I was trying to say.
Yeah, again, essentially, that's the essence of it. That the associate can basically be you, and you're comfortable with that. I mean, I've left shows. I remember one time I left an outdoor show in the hands of an associate, and I said, look, I'm not going to be here when the sun's going down later or going down earlier, so you'll see those cues, and this is my intention, and just adjust it as you need to. And that's a certain level of trust in artistic decisions.
Yeah, I mean, and just to follow up real quick, I just had the show move from Chicago to here out in Long Beach, and I had nothing to do with it. I mean, my associate, David Bradkey, who's my associate in Chicago when I do shows out there, he brought it. He brought the show in. I didn't even go in for dress rehearsal. We talked. How's it going, Dave? It's going great. Great. No problem. Do you want me to come? No, you're fine. Don't worry. And then I showed up opening night, and he did a fantastic job. It looks like my lighting. So that's basically what an associate is. I don't know if the assistant is in the same world as an associate. Absolutely not.
Let me say one thing about the associate, and it kind of goes without saying, but since Luke is asking the question, he may not know. I leave a lot of equipment decisions to my associate. So I will say, this is what I'm going to do. Could you look at moving light A and moving light B and come back to me and tell me which one you think will work better to achieve what we're after, given the budget, given the rigging, given what we're doing. So I leave a lot of that kind of equipment testing and researching to the associate.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, the associate, two minds are better than one, and the associate may have that information. You may not have that information. And they also may know more about the theater that you're going into. There are a lot of things. Like, for instance, I knew I needed to have Nick do this because he knows New York. I'm not a New York designer. So, he knows everybody. So if I needed something like, a certain vendor, or actually a certain type of light, a LED tape or whatever, he knows exactly where to source it because that's where he's from. He does Broadway shows. He knows what's going on. Anyway, guys, guess what?
I know it. It's a Hammond organ solo.
It's that Hammond organ solo in the background tells us that once again, you've spent a precious 40 minutes of your life listening to Light Talk. Hey, you can listen to Light Talk every week on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, SoundCloud, Spotify, and don't forget to join the Light Talk on Facebook page so that you can post your questions and comments.
No guarantee is offered regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on this podcast.
In other words, don't burn the theater down.
Light Talk is written and produced by the Lumen Brothers, coming to you from Long Beach, Gainesville, and the Lone Star State.
And be sure to tune in next Saturday when we discuss, how do I know if a bulb is about to die? I need some help choosing a new console for my school. What's the best material for a psych? And why do you Americans worry so much about size? My hands!
My hands. All that and a new sponsor, Light Talk, broadcasting questionable Lumen knowledge and humor all over the globe.
So we'll see you all next Saturday morning. Bye-bye from Light Talk. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Light Talk.